blocking wall where they had used everything but the kitchen sink to throw in there, which was our first clue that the end of the site may have been associated with some sort of military encounter, because they were blocking the entrance to the city.
To get through the massive wood gate, the invaders built a roaring hot fire next to it.
What we find from the superstructure of the wall, the collapse of the mud brick, which was vitrified, almost reddish, showing the flame that was up against the town wall on the outside as they attacked. It doesn't indicate that they actually entered into the city, but certainly that there was some sort of an attack on the city.
There's no way to know when the attack happened or what became of the people who lived here. All we know is that by about 2350 BC, no one was living in the town or using the cemetery. Like Lot and his two daughters, any survivors from Babadraw were now on their own. In the Bible, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah doesn't have a happy ending, even for Lot and his family, who managed to escape. We're told that Lot came to the city of Zoar following the destruction, but was afraid to live there. So Lot and his two daughters took refuge in a cave. Cut off from other men, and perhaps still under the corrupting influence of the city, Lot's daughters decided to seduce their father. They plied Lot with wine, and then had sex with him. Both girls became pregnant, and the sons they bore went on to father two more tribes of Canaanites, who the Israelites later conquered. The Bible locates Zoar near the modern city of Safi, about 30 miles south of Babadraw. And that's where Greek archaeologists discovered something in 1989 that had been lost for 1,000 years. A Byzantine monastery built in front of a cave dedicated to St. Lot.
They thought that this particular cave where they built their church was the cave where Lot and his daughters lived. Well, there's no way to prove that for certain, but it is interesting that inside the cave they did find evidence for occupation back in that time period.
That time period would have put the occupation of Lot's cave in the early Bronze Age, contemporary with Babadraw. And it was just south of Babadraw that Tom Schaub and his partner practically stumbled on a second lost city. It started when they noticed an odd rock formation on top of a hill. It turned out to be a town wall.
This is the same wall that Walter Arrest and I spied from the road as we drove up during our 1973 survey. We almost ran up the steep hills of Numeera, came along and walked along the southern wall line, began to see possible wall lines of structures within the town site.
An examination of pottery shards convinced them they'd found another early Bronze Age town, just a few miles from Babadraw. They called the new site Numeera. Like Babadraw, it was walled, but it was much smaller, home to a few hundred people at most.
We began to realize that this site was contemporary with Babadraw, and eventually during our excavations we began to realize it was almost like a sister city.
I think it was
a fairly prosperous town, but a kind of suburb of the larger city to the north, Babadra.
But unlike Babadra, Numira had been abandoned not too long after it was built.
Numira was occupied for a relatively brief period, perhaps no more than a century, and fortunately for archaeologists, never settled again, so nobody actually lived on top of it, dug into the remains, reused the stones.
2 settlements, one large, one small, a few hours' walk from each other. Was it possible they'd found Sodom's sister city of Gomorrah?
If Abraham goes way back in early history, the only sites from that period down to the Iron Age that are walled towns, that are sizable, are these 2 sites of Babadra and Numira. So they have become, in the minds of many, prime candidates for the ancient traditions of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Like Babadra, Numira showed signs that its inhabitants had fled and never returned, but not because of a war.
There's no signs of breaching of walls that would have occurred by warfare. There are no remains of weapons. There are no dead soldiers, as you find, for example, in a number of sites where there have been battles.
What they did find was the skeletons of 2 men, crushed to death.
Well, this is the tower. It's in front of that tower, of course, that we found the most striking evidence of the last days of the town, because there were 2 skeletons underneath the collapse of the tower.
And these were the skeletons of adult males who had obviously died suddenly. This wasn't a burial. This wasn't a tomb. These were people who died in an open public area. And we think that they had died because the tower, where they were either squatting or perhaps they'd been left behind as guards when everybody else left the city, simply collapsed on top of it.
The suspected culprit? Another earthquake.
My hypothesis is that the inhabitants perhaps experienced a preliminary tremor and left the city for the open country because they knew they'd be safer there. And a few stayed behind, maybe as guards, and they were the ones who died in the city.